We would like to make you a few questions about your lectures that we have enjoyed deeply. Professor Allen, you have shown us wonderful series of cases of different clinical situations, wonderfully treated with an allograft, and we were wondering, can these results be expected also when we treat gingival recessions, mucosal recessions around implants?
Treating recessions like I showed around teeth can be applied to implants, but it's a completely different setting and a different set of rules. So it's much more difficult to treat the problems at an existing implant site. Far better to prepare the site ahead of time, as my colleague Eric showed so brilliantly in his presentation today. So I would say, yes, you can in certain circumstances, but it is a little bit of a different setting that requires a different approach.
Thank you.
If I can comment?
Yeah, for sure.
I think if you have this kind of recession on an implant, you better remove the implant first, I think. Something. No, if you have 7-8 millimeter recession, maybe Pat or Giovanni Zucchelli, they can do it, but not everybody can do this. The purpose of an implant is not to get these kind of recessions. It's much more difficult to treat. What do you think, my friend?
I totally agree with Eric, because if you had 7 to 8 millimeters of recession at an implant site, there's a much bigger problem. And it might be implant position. You cannot treat an implant that's out of position with soft tissue grafting and expect it to last, for one thing. Probably also there would be a considerable amount of bone loss. You can't cover a root that completely, in any case, recession at a root site where there's been interproximal bone loss. So while you can use this procedure to thicken tissue at an implant site, to stabilize mobile marginal tissue, to cover a root, completely different situation, or to cover an exposed implant, a different situation. So yeah, an implant would be, I mean, most of the time, you wouldn't be able to have the same result you have at a tooth site.
Okay, thank you.
We wanted to ask you also regarding volume augmentation with allograft around implants. Is it something that you have experience and that you can comment on?
So what indication you're talking about exactly? Is it like bone augmentation without buccal bone, or is it just filling a socket with the buccal wall, or is it what kind?
Let me just give you a simple example. We're talking about allografts such as the one that Pat Allen showed us today, and the question was if you could use it, say, for example, in an immediate implant placement, as some of the cases that you showed, as an alternative to minimize the volume changes that will occur after extraction.
But you mean alloderm? Allograft, but bone allograft or soft tissue allograft? I have no experience. Ah, sorry.
No, that's... I'd much rather you answer that question, because my experience with implants and grafting is after the implants have been placed and a problem arises. So using bone grafting and an allograft is, I mean, to cover the soft tissue allograft is a completely different problem, and it would be very complex to try to answer it in a short time. That would take a lecture, I think, to answer that question.
So you may not have such a big experience with allografts, but you definitely have a very wide experience with digital workflow in the clinical practice. So Professor Van Dooren, I want to ask you something that really, I think it's an important question for me. Do you think that digital workflow is going to make more accessible the treatment of very challenging cases for the clinicians? Or it just changed the different skills that we have to have? I mean, in the past we needed to be very skilled surgeon and to work with a very skilled prosthetic technician to achieve those results. Nowadays, digital workflow is going to make these results more accessible for our clinicians, or we just have to have other kind of skills?
But I think digital workflow makes it, first of all, more accessible, because if you just copy nature and a machine mills the nature, it means the form and the surface will be superior to what many of the technicians are layering. Now, what I think is very important in digital is the possibility to plan everything ahead. It's like before we were more relying on our intuitive skills, like sometimes not really planning all the cases from A to Z, which means that if you have an implant case, a surgeon would come in, do his job, deliver to the prosthodontist, then the prosthodontist needs to start. Then the dental technician needs to start. Today, you start the case by gathering all the information which goes from. There's 4 files basically the dentist needs. It's a JPEG, it's a picture, it's a movie, eventually it's an STL, and it's a DICOM. But gathering these files together allows you to plan 10 times better than what I was used to do 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So the planning for me, backward planning, like we know where we're going to head, what is the best way to get there?
So I wanted to ask you, Eric, you mentioned that you were working on printing soft tissue for soft tissue grafting. Is this something that you can tell us, just as much as you can explain us what is the research on and what is the focus, if you can?
I cannot, I'm sorry. But that's just a project that is going on, and I think it will be very, very interesting to be able to print tissue. You need to imagine you're going to print from one cell a graft. That's basically the principle. Of course, there's regulatory issues, especially in Europe and maybe also in the US probably, but I think that's the way it's going to go. It's people who design prosthodontics. Imagine now you have the final design. You're going to print the tissue according to the final result you want to get. With the thickness, with the elasticity that you can modify, many parameters. So I already told you too much, so I have to stop.
Thank you. Going back to new developments, you explain us, I'm going to direct the question to Pat Allen. You explain us about a new device and your experience, which is called Novomix, I think you mentioned. Novomix or Novomatrix. Would you like to comment on your experience with it and what advantages does it bring?
Yes, the question's about Novomatrix, which is a new porcine product that was approved for use in Europe in December. So it will be available, I believe, the beginning of July. So it takes a little time after approval for processing and distribution. So I had the privilege of working with it in some of the clinical trials. And today I showed a 5-year outcome on one case I treated. I believe I have about 10 other cases. And what I found with it is the primary thing is that the handling characteristics are superior to the alloderm that I was using in the past. Alloderm was superior to the other products, in my opinion, on the market at the time. But there was a variability because it's a human product. With the porcine product, there's total control. And control in terms of the animals, of course, are medical facilities, are raised in medical facilities, fed the same, and they all die at the same age, and donate their skin at the same age. So the characteristics of the product then are very consistent, which means thickness, rigidity, all the handling characteristics are very consistent, which makes it easier to use. And then curiously, it seems to show a lesser inflammatory reaction. Anytime you implant something, inflammation is part of healing, but there can be a little bit of excessive production of cytokines depending on the processing and the origin of the tissue. So there's quite a variability among the products on the market now in terms of cytokine production. What I've seen clinically is less inflammation around the Novomatrix product. So it's favorable in that regard. And from a clinician standpoint, it's favorable because of consistent handling characteristics. Thickness is the same, rigidity is the same, and ease of use is similar. And as soon as it becomes available in the States, which it's not yet, I will switch to that product as well.
So I think that we definitely have to invite you both to the next Congress in 2020 to hear about Novomatrix and about graft printing, no? So we have one more question for Professor Van Dooren, because you saw us very beautifully how you use the contralateral tooth to design the contour of your preparations and your abutments. How do you do this same design when you do not have a contralateral tooth and you have multiple missing teeth?
You mean if you work analog way? Is that what you say? Sorry? What is your question? How to do it?
If you don't have a contralateral tooth, to mimic the profile in order to modify the soft tissue contour, how do you design these abutments and this contour?
I think in the very near future, as you have libraries of tooth forms, you will have libraries of root forms, and you will have to select a root form, because it's not only the tooth continues into the root. So I think the problem with the libraries is that it's only the crown, and it should continue. So if we should have the combination between the intraoral scanning of the crown form, but also combine it with DICOM files and get root forms that you will just take from a library.
So there's much coming for the future.
There's really a lot.
Thank you very much for your answers. We hope to see you soon again here in Spain. Thank you very much.